following program is from NET, the Public Television Network.
Good evening. In this election year, most Americans have been exposed to the positions of the three major presidential candidates, but there are other candidates for the presidency whose names and ideas may not be as well known, but who nonetheless speak to and for segments of American voters. In this year of profound political division and passion, it's more important than ever that the voices of these candidates be brought to the voting public. Today, NET has invited 6 presidential candidates whose names appear on the ballot of one or more states to give their views on the major issues of the day. Our candidates are, in order, Mr. E. Harold Munn, Sr., the Associate Dean of Hillsdale College in Michigan, the presidential candidate of the 99-year-old Prohibition Party. Mr. Henning A. Blomain, a machine assembler from Cambridge, Massachusetts, the Socialist Labor Party's candidate for the presidency. For the first time in 28 years, the Communist Party is running a candidate for president. Though only on the ballot in 2 states, Mrs. Charlene Mitchell campaigns across the country for her party. The standard bearer for the Socialist Workers' Party is a New York garment cutter and the only presidential candidate who campaigned in Vietnam, Mr. Fred Halstead. And the candidate of the Universal Party is the founder of the Universal Life Church from Modesto, California, the Reverend Kirby James Hendley. Mr. Elbridge Cleaver of the Peace and Freedom Party accepted our invitation but was unable to appear at the last moment. We'll now ask each of our guests for a 2-minute opening statement. First of all, Mr. Blomain of the Socialist Labor Party.
The Socialist Labor Party has had a very interesting history in the United States. As a matter of fact, its antecedents go back to 1876, and it was reorganized on its present basis in 1890, and has run presidential candidates in every election since 1892. The Socialist Labor Party has never addressed itself to attempting to patch up capitalism in any way. It has no reforms in its platform, and it recognizes that to try to reform capitalism is purely dealing with effects. And it has always insisted, in accordance with the teachings on which it bases its entire philosophy and program, that of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, that there is no prospect, actually, of the working class achieving any amelioration for their condition as long as this system remains with us. And history, in many respects, has proved the Socialist Labor Party right in this regard. All of the reform measures that were passed during the Roosevelt administration, all of the patchwork measures that are now being enacted, haven't removed the social or the economic ills. As a matter of fact, they are still with us to a great extent.
The presidential candidate of the Socialist Workers' Party, Mr. Fred Halstead.
Well, in this campaign, we've got 2 slogans to sum up our approach to the 2 major questions facing the country. That is the war in Vietnam and the crisis in their central cities and the struggle of the black people for equality. Humphrey, Nixon, and Wallace have the same identical slogans on these questions. All 3 of them have the same slogans. Their slogans are peace with honor, by which they mean a piece of Vietnam for the American military, and law and order, by which they mean put the black people down. My slogans on these questions are to bring the GIs home from Vietnam now. That is an immediate withdrawal from Vietnam, and black control of the black community on the second question. I was recently in Vietnam, and I went there to talk to GIs, find out what they thought about the war. I found more of them there were opposed to the war than were in favor of it. And they know from looking in front of their face that it has nothing to do with freedom, that fight over there, because that government that we're supporting there is a puppet that was created by the United States and which doesn't represent the people. And what is involved is that the American military is being used as the private protection agency for U.S. big business investments and future investment possibilities in that whole part of the world. And it's a very poor reason to lose 35,000 GIs dead. I've been campaigning among young people and GIs, and I asked them to vote for me and anybody who is opposed to the war in Vietnam to cast a protest vote for the Socialist Workers' Party. We're on the ballot in 19 states. And that'll be a more effective way, even in pragmatic, practical politics, to end that war than voting for people who are going to carry it on.
The candidate of the Universal Party, Mr. Hensley.
We're glad to be here and give our views on this program, and we basically have a few things that's different from some of the other candidates, and that one is we want to do away with the Electoral College and replace it with a popular vote for a way of electing a president. Another thing we see, which we will speak later on, is the riots in the street and the uprising among our younger generation of people, which be very confusing today, and I haven't seen any of this political candidates have given me a satisfied answer. So we're coming up with a new one. We believe that we should give reward some of these kids in a place of punishing them all the time. We would get a lot better results from it. We find from within our own home that if we reward our children, we get lots better results than if we're always punishment. Another thing we want to do away with, this here burden of the income tax system that we have, which is so strong, that's burdened us down. We've had 20 of the best years we've ever had is the last 20 years, and if we haven't paid anything on the national debt in 20 years, when are we going to pay it? So we say that we won't never pay it. So let's just do away with the income tax system. And another thing we want to do, we believe, personally I believe this, not so much of the party, is that we should bring church and state together. Thank you.
The opening statement for the candidate of the Communist Party, Mrs. Charlene Mitchell.
Yes, as you've said, this is the first time in 28 years that we have had a presidential candidate. But that does not take away from the seriousness of our campaign. We are indeed very serious about it, because it is very clear to us that of the so-called major candidates, that there is not very much difference when it comes to the issues that face the American people. And the only clear alternative that American people have today in the electoral process and facing up to and answering issues is that alternative to the left. We too feel that capitalism, it is impossible for capitalism to answer the needs of the American people. But there are immediate needs that the American people have, and unless we begin to struggle for those immediate needs, it will become impossible for people to see the need for the changing of this system to one of socialism, whereby man can live in a more just and humane way. Thank you.
The candidate of the Prohibition Party, Mr. Munn.
The Prohibition Party is an old-line political party, which, as you mentioned earlier, was started 99 years ago. Next year in Chicago, we expect to celebrate our 100th anniversary. And we have been regularly sponsoring candidates for the presidency during this long period of time. The Prohibition Party is probably the only political party which comes out definitely and specifically for a conservative commitment to Christian principles and their application in government. And this is one of the things which we emphasize. We have a 28-plank platform which is comprehensive in its nature. We ought to be called the American Christian Party rather than the Prohibition Party, but it's not easy to change the name of a party after that party has gotten underway. There are some very practical roadblocks which have been placed in the way of a change of name by the major parties. But our 28-plank platform does survey the field of government. And as an educator and as a citizen, I feel that it's quite important that anyone who wishes to run for the presidency of our country must have a program of government that is broad and that is comprehensive in nature. We feel that there are some critical issues before the people of the United States at the present time, and we propose to deal with these constructively and positively and aggressively as America's Christian Party.
Now we plan to explore the views of each of our guests in turn through question and answer. Mr. Blomain, your party has been in existence for 80 years now. Do you really have any hope that capitalism can be abolished by the peaceful means you advocate without a revolution?
Well, in the first place, capitalism is definitely on a decline now. It can't solve the problems that are a product of its own inherent nature. And as a consequence, the Socialist Labor Party feels reasonably certain that the time is going to come when the working class of America, realizing that the social and economic problems that confront them cannot be solved under capitalism, will adopt the program of the Socialist Labor Party, which consists simply in the working class organizing to vote at the ballot box for the candidates of the Socialist Labor Party, thereby voting for the establishment of a bona fide socialist society in America. But we in the SLP recognize that socialism isn't going to be established merely by the vote. It's going to require an economic organization that will back up the right expressed at the ballot box. And this organization is the Socialist Industrial Union, to be organized in all of the industries throughout America. And once these unions are organized, the workers will elect their own foremen and superintendents and management committees, and also representatives from the respective industries to an industrial congress. The political candidates then, upon receiving a majority vote, would take political office for the purpose of adjourning it and handing the reins of government over to the Socialist Industrial Unions. And the Socialist Industrial Unions would take and hold and operate the industries in the interests of society.
Which will come first, your triumph at the polls or the organization
This will be
of these?
coincidental. And the organization, the Socialist Industrial Union, will take and hold and operate the industries in the interests of society, abolish the wage system and the system for production for sale, and establish the society in which we have full democratic control, collective ownership, and everyone would receive the full social value of his toil.
Well, Mr. Blomain, in the 1930s, the various left-wing parties used to collect a total of numbering in the millions of votes. They've declined since. Why, and what do you think might restore their fortunes?
Well, I think that an examination of capitalism reveals what has actually happened. Capitalism has become increasingly dependent on producing war material. Dr. Ralph E. Lapp recently pointed out that since the end of the Korean War, America has spent $1 trillion on armaments alone. The war in Vietnam thus far, during its active phase, has cost America about $100 billion. Oh. And the federal budget this year, appropriations for military purposes come to $70 billion. Coupling this with deficit financing and hypodermics applied to the capitalist system has for a time perpetuated it. But the time is rapidly coming when these are no longer going to serve the purpose for which they're intended, and capitalism will not be able to survive.
Are there any socialist countries in the world today whose present systems approximate your ideal, Mr. Blomain?
No, as a matter of fact, many years ago, Daniel De Leon, the intellectual founder of the Socialist Labor Party, pointed out that nobody leans toward socialism. You either are a socialist or you aren't. And an examination of the economy in the Soviet Union or Scandinavia or England or anywhere else where they claim they have socialism reveals the fact that they have all of the economic factors which would not exist under socialism, namely the wage system, production for sale, political government, economic classes. All of these would not exist in a socialist society.
You talk of abolishing wages. Do you hold with the ancient dictum to each according to his needs, from each according to his means?
Ultimately, when socialism is established, this will become the prevailing rule and dictum, as you put it.
What would you substitute for wages?
Well, we'll use a system of labor vouchers. It's estimated now that it takes about 57 man-hours to produce an automobile. In whatever industry you yourself may work, you would contribute 57 of your man-hours to the social store and receive a labor voucher to the tune of 57 man-hours, with which you could acquire a car. A house probably takes 100 man-hours to turn out. And anyone wanting a house under socialism would have to contribute 100 of his man-hours to the social store and receive labor vouchers in that amount and thereby acquire a house.
You don't think it's significant, Mr. Beaumain, that other societies founded on the intention to abolish wages have in practice not found it feasible to do so? You still think it can be done?
It certainly can. As a matter of fact, capitalism is dependent upon the wage system. Without the wage system, there'd be no profit system, because the total wealth created by our working class, and our working class consists of managerial employees, scientists, inventors, designers, people in the drafting room, right down to the fellows who sweep the floor. And wages constitute only a part of labor's product. The rest of it goes to the capitalist class in the form of surplus value, out of which they're able to obtain their profit.
Thank you, Mr. Beaumain. We must turn now to Mr. Halstead of the Socialist Labor Party.
Socialist Workers.
Sorry, pardon me, Socialist Workers Party. Is yours, sir, a less revolutionary than Mr. Beaumain's party? It's sometimes described as reformist. Is that a fair appellation?
Now, we're revolutionary and we're Marxist. We don't... we do operate in day-to-day activities. Like, we try to end the war in Vietnam, and we believe in supporting the struggle of black power, and we support strikes for higher wages and things like that. Some people call those reforms, but we don't see any contradiction in that and building a revolutionary movement which can challenge the power of the capitalist class and the two major parties and change it. We think that the two go hand in hand.
How do you view the reforms of the system under the New Deal, the Fair Deal, the Great Society, and so forth? Do you welcome those or regard them as subterfuges? Or?
Well, those are things like the 8-hour day and things like that were things that working people fought for, and they won them. And sure, we're for that. But they weren't given to the people by capitalists or by somebody who was trying to patch up the system. They were fought for. And for example, we can end the war in Vietnam right now if the people get out in the streets and fight for that end. And in the course of doing that, we'll build an independent movement in the country which is outside of and opposed to the parties which are controlled by big business, in whose interest this war is being fought. Just the other day here in San Francisco, there were several hundred GIs themselves who marched in front of a big, massive anti-war parade to let the American people know they're opposed to this thing. And that's the kind of a development that I encourage and am involved in helping to organize, and that I use my election campaign to encourage. Likewise, the struggle of the black people for control of the schools in the black community so they can teach their children some African history and history of the Afro-American people in an honest way, and instill instead of a sense of inferiority, a sense of pride and self-respect. And those are revolutionary developments which are helping to build a movement in the country outside of and opposed to the two capitalist parties, which are, as I say, controlled by big business and operate. They conceive the national interest to be identical with the narrow interests of the major stockholders and the major corporations, and invest all this money overseas and send the army after it to protect it. But that's not in our interest, and it's not in the interest of the GIs and the ordinary people.
Mr. Beaumain says that he does not identify with any of the socialist or communist regimes now in existence in the world. Do you?
Well, I don't think there's any utopian society in existence in the world, but I support certain things. I support the Chinese Revolution and the Russian Revolution and the Cuban Revolution and the American Revolution when it took place. I support in general revolutionary developments of oppressed people around the world to try to improve their conditions.
How about the social democratic parties of Western Europe?
Well, they're not.
Scandinavia.
They're not revolutionary like the British Labour Party. They nationalize a few industries that are going broke under capitalism anyway and do the capitalists a favor. No, we don't propose that. We propose to nationalize the ones that are doing very well also.
You have said that gun control laws will not control the brutality of racist police. Are you against gun control laws?
Yes, I'm against it because that's an interference with a traditional American constitutional right, and I think that people have a right to have a gun in their house. to protect themselves. I'm not talking about going out and shooting up somebody else's neighborhood. But the real source of this big argument about gun control laws now are the struggles that are taking place in the black community. And, you know, they never talked about this when the Ku Klux Klan was shooting up somebody else's neighborhood and when Al Capone was running around Chicago. No, I'm in favor of that. I'm in favor of that traditional American right, and I don't want to see any of those individual rights taken away from people.
But if you have a situation in which left-wing militant black groups are able to hold arms for self-defense, aren't you going to have to grant the same right to the Minutemen? They've had the right for you. The white people have been armed in this country for a long time. Nothing new about that. Nothing new about that at all. But you wouldn't disarm white people. No, I don't say I'm disarming anybody. I say every citizen has a right to the traditional American right, which is written into the American Constitution, to have a rifle or a shotgun in his house. That's all. Do you feel that the New Deal, by regulating and restraining capitalism, is taking the wind out of the sails at all of left-wing movements in this country? Well, no, the left-wing movement is growing rapidly now again, and the youth are beginning to become radical. You've got a radical swing in the country today. This is a complicated question. If any people want further information about my party, they can write to the Socialist Workers' Party, 873 Broadway, New York. That's 873 Broadway, New York. For further information. It's a non-commercial network, Mr. Houston. Do you see any possibility that left-wing groups, those represented by you and Mr. Mulblane and Mrs. Mitchell, from whom we'll hear in a moment, will in time get together, pool their strength? We're in favor of that. We're in favor of that. And we offer repeatedly to get together on any points where we can agree. And for example, the Communist Party and my party do work together occasionally on points where we can agree. We make the same offer to the Socialist Labor Party. Unfortunately, we don't agree on the electoral procedure because it's a principle with us not to vote for capitalist candidates. The Communist Party usually supports somebody in the Democratic Party. I'm very glad to see them run a candidate now, and I think that'll be a blow against the general anti-communist hysteria in the country. But yes, we're for unity on the left, and we work for it whenever we can get it. Ecumenicalism of the left, perhaps. Yes. Perhaps. Mr. Hensley, you're on the conservative side of the spectrum, sir, you and your Universal Party. Now, some right-wing candidates withdrew from the election this year and decided instead of running to support Mr. George Wallace. Did you consider this? And if so, why did you not do that?
Well, George Wallace, only a few things, just very few things I agree with him on. And that is, one is turning the government back to the states, you know, states' rights, and that way, that I agree with. But many other points that he made, I disagree with him, though I helped him get on the ballot in California. Why did you do that if you Well, because I'd like to see more opportunity for people who do vote to have more of an opportunity to select candidates from, see. What kind of assistance did you give Mr. Wallace? Oh, just only registered for him so he could get on. Oh, see. So, well, you know, naturally that I knew a lot of people and they helped me. This is, say, a turnabout play. And that's why I helped him to get on the ballot. I have no intentions of voting for him and didn't at that time, but I did think that I would help this fellow or this lady or anybody to get on the ballot if I could be of any help to him, which did not destroy me. Do you agree with Mr. Wallace's views as you understand them on race relations? No. I'm strictly not a racist at all. I believe in integration 100%. Well, you said that, but you've also said we've been moving too fast on race relations. Now, that is true. You see, I say that you cannot force, we'll use this little point that I've used before, you cannot force love upon another person. You cannot force me to enjoy somebody in my house that I don't want there after you force them in there, see? But I believe in integration. I believe that everybody should have a right to that. It's right for him, regardless of who it hurts. But forcing it, I do not believe in that. Do you mean that you object to any of the provisions of the recent civil rights bills? Yes, some of them I would project on. I would disagree heartily. And here's where I might agree with Wallace. I do not think it's right to move children from one side of town to another and just to integrate them. We call busing them from one school to another. How about public accommodations, the right of a citizen to go and get a cup of coffee or a hotel room? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We believe that every man should have that right because it's a public place. It's for them all. But now many conservatives say if you tell a restaurant owner who he may serve, must serve or not serve, you're interfering with his rights. You don't go along with that? No, I do not, because he opened it up and got in a public place and did not take his commitments out for that purpose, you know what I mean, to do that. Now, if he would have had a Socialist club somewhere and in the background would have stated that he was doing that for a particular group, for I only accept men in here, see, I would not accept a woman, then I would say he might have that right.
Mr. Hensley, you believe in the abolition of the federal income tax, I believe.
Absolutely. That's my main point.
Well, now, would you have the federal government do much less than it now does? Or if not, how would you have it meet its obligations financially without the revenue from income tax?
Well, let me say this. The last 20 years, we've had the best financial years we've had, I think, probably in recorded history as far as America's concerned. And if we didn't pay anything on our national debt in 20 years, how or when are we going to pay this when we're paying some $5 billion in interest alone each year? That's soon going to eat us up.
Wait a minute. If you would abolish the income tax, you'll have less prospect than ever of paying off the debt.
Well, let me finish the point.
Excuse me, sir.
All right, then if we didn't, I say this, let's just abolish the income tax system to begin with, and which we'll do some of these days to be practically the same thing. One of these days we'll wipe the slate clean anyway. So let's just do away with the income tax and then appropriate the money and have Congress, everybody send in what they need, these income, and then they figure up the bill, then have Congress to authorize printing of the money to do those jobs with, and then we'll cut out all of these here tax collectors and all these big buildings around the country that we have and all this debt that we're in, which we will finally have to wipe off someday, and we'll start out. Because we can't go broke as long as we don't let the money get out of the country and the wealth get out of the country.
Well, what backing would there be for this currency if it was just printed willy-nilly?
It'd be sort of like a family. As long as the money stayed in the family, there wouldn't be nobody broke. It would just keep going around and around circles. See, it never would. You could not. The country would not go broke as long as you didn't let the wealth get out of the country. As long as you kept it here, it would be just like it. It's always in the family. We're a family, and we'd have it here. So
you said the federal government would just print whatever notes were necessary to meet its obligations.
Yeah. You see, here's the thing why we would like to do that. We believe that the man who pays the bill should have the power. We think that the money flows from that man at the farthest consumer. That he pays the bill, doesn't he? In everything, he pays the bill. The consumer, these labor boys, he pays the bill. So the man who pays the bill should be the man who the power goes. The power should flow exactly the same way the money flows. The money flows from the individual to Washington. We say that the power should flow from the individual to Washington and take the big government away from these and appropriate a lot more money for schools. You see, that's one thing that I'm very much interested in. I say that we take boys and girls from the age of 6 to 16 and educate them during that period and make good boys and girls out of them and reward them and see that we're on their side. We will have a lot better system, then we won't need it so much of this.
Another major plank in your platform, Reverend, is the ending of the principle of separation of church and state, which of course is one of the cardinal principles of our system. Isn't yours a revolutionary notion, sir?
Up to a point, I guess it would be. And sometimes I think it might be more. See, most of people say that they are against church and state become one. I say that to have to become one, the only hope for mankind is. Because anything that separates people is wrong. And there's nothing in this world that separates men more than religion. Nothing. I don't care what it is. You find them out, they separate. Then next is politics. My daddy would not have let me stay in his house if I'd have been on the other side of the fences. So we must do something with it. The thing that's separating us, we must break down. So that is some of the things that we are interested in. Sure we are.
But what religion are you going to establish as a state religion?
A state religion is this. I thought about this for some 5 years before I come up with the idea. The only way you can do it in a society as we have today is let every man believe the way he wants to, without question of his faith. See, we will license a man without question of his faith and for life and without a price. We believe that every man's a minister. We'll send anybody anywhere a minister's like. We don't care who he is. That's what the government's been after so much about. It's a lot of these here boys, that's been staying out of the draft because they get a 4D deferment. But we're not out to do that. But we'll give anybody a minister. We believe that everybody's a minister. We don't believe that just, we say the only difference between any human being is his education or his knowledge. That's the only difference. Race is not a difference, and nothing is the difference, only the knowledge that he possesses is the only thing that separates two human beings.
Mrs. Mitchell, the candidate of the Communist Party, is it fair to say that the Communist Party in this country would have got a great deal more support than it did back in the 30s and 40s when it was last on the ballot if it had not been for a widespread feeling, which you might well challenge, that the party was a creature, an instrument of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union?
Oh, I think that there was such a widespread feeling that this was true. I don't think it ever was true. But the acceptance of the Communist Party by the American people has not to do with whether or not they felt we were tied to another country, or more specifically to the Soviet Union. It has had to do with the repressive legislation by the United States government on the Communist Party, unlike on any other political party in the history of this country.
But the bulk of that legislation came during and after what you might call the McCarthy period, back in the 30s and 40s. It
started in 1946.
Yeah, but back in the 30s and 40s, when you were on the ballot, quite a few intellectuals drew away, or went in and sometimes came out of the CP on this ground of domination by the Soviet Union. Now, is it not true that the American Communist Party, throughout the 30s and 40s, whenever anything was written or said about Stalinist excesses and terror, denied it, only to live to see Khrushchev himself confirm it at the 20th Party Congress of the Soviet Party?
I think you might say that there's a lot of truth in that. But I don't think it's the important thing, because that is not why people did not come into the Communist Party later, because those are the years when the Communist Party was the biggest. That was the time when we had 100,000 members in the Communist Party up until the time of World War II. Our membership began to decrease at the time of the Cold War with the repressive measures.
Are those repressive measures now waning, do you think?
Yes, they are not just waning, they are being defeated time after time. And on this, I would have to agree very much with what Mr. Halstead said, that people win victories. And one of the victories that people have been winning is the victory over McCarthyism. Now, there's a certain aim toward reestablishing what McCarthyism stands for in this country. And I think the Wallace candidacy is part and parcel of all of that. But by all means, what we are going through today is a process of winning certain victories. We lose some also. And I don't think people can stand aloof from the losses that people have been stacking.
Do you find, as a communist leader, that you have access to forums and to the news media more than communists would have had 10, 15 years ago?
Yes, again, because of the same kind of repressive legislation. It was impossible, for example, up until very lately, for a communist to speak on many university campuses. And what Mr. Cleaver is facing today, and I gather the reason that he is not here, is part of what we went through for years. It was impossible for a communist to speak or teach on any campus in the United States.
Well, presumably it was difficult at one time for a known communist to get a job or an apartment. Is that eased up? Is it easier to be a communist in the United States now than it was 15 years ago?
Well, that depends on your position of being a communist. It's never easy to be a communist. It's never easy to be a revolutionary. To be a revolutionary means you have to have a certain kind of dedication to a movement, to a principle, which says, first of all, that you want to overturn a capitalist system. Now, that does not take place with some ease or comfort. That takes place because you know that you have to go out there every day and organize, that you have to mobilize people in that process. You have to talk to people when you believe very fundamentally in trade union policies where they develop the rights of working people. But when those trade union policies deny the rights of people, like what is happening with UFT in New York, then you've got all kinds of problems that you have to deal with. Here is a racist strike. So that regardless as to whether or not you could have been a teacher or you were a teacher as an open communist, you have to make a decision now. And that decision is that that is a racist strike, and no communist teacher is about to obey that kind of a strike. See, these are the kinds of revolutionary practices which we have to deal with. So it's never easy to be a communist. And one who would ever think in terms of ease is already, in my opinion, worrying too much about his own comfort rather than being a communist.
May we go into the party's relationship, if any, with the international communist movement? Is there anything, for instance, any subject on which you disagree with the current views or policies of the Soviet Communist Party or Soviet government?
Well, there have been any number of debates that have been going on in the world communist movement now for many years. And on some, I have disagreements. I don't think to voice my agreements or disagreements to either you or this audience is going to give us enough time for me to even clarify them. So rather than say to you where I have disagreements and without having the time to clarify it, I think would only confuse people.
Well, let me put it another way, Mrs. Mitchell. Back in the 1930s and 40s, if an American communist leader disagreed with the current views of the Soviet Communist Party, he was quickly denounced from Moscow and usually apologized and recanted. Could you, as a Communist Party candidate for President of the United States, now disagree with the Soviet party or government on an issue and retain your position?
Well, again, let me say this. I am running for President of the United States. I do not keep up daily, I can't, with what happens in the Soviet Union or the rest of the socialist world. Any question that you ask me, I am bound and determined to answer your question where it relates to United States politics and where I stand. Now, whether that is going to be in agreement with what somebody in the Soviet Union might say, I don't know.
You must have been
I mean,
asked
how would I know?
May I ask you how you feel about the relationship between the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia, the presence of the troops from the other socialist countries in Czechoslovakia? Are you for it or against it?
My party has taken a position that it was regrettable but necessary. But let me say something here. You see, you talk about this monolith and so on. There's such disagreement within the world communist movement on Czechoslovakia that you could, you know, it's very difficult to even decide where one party is.
But precisely, but this is the new thing, surely. Surely, 20 years ago, there would have been no difference. The party would have been set.
But let me ask you a question. Is American imperialism less or more satisfied with that? And do you think that's going to make American imperialism want to accept Charlene Mitchell as a major candidate within the United States? Czechoslovakia, what happens in Czechoslovakia is not going to determine that. What's going to determine whether or not Charlene Mitchell is going to be a major candidate is when people realize that whatever the differences are within the world communist movement, that socialism provides the way to answer these problems. American capitalism does not provide that way.
All right, let's come back to this country. Are you in favor of a coalition of the left, of a popular front, so to speak, as Mr. Halstead said he was?
He did not say popular front, that's right. As he has said, we have worked together on some things, and where we have agreement, I have no difficulty in working with any of the parties on the left. But where we have basic and principled disagreements, it seems to me that it would do the left a disservice to have unity just for the purpose of unity. I would hope that we would clarify some of those issues. Most basically, those issues would be how we see the struggle for black liberation, for example. Because I do not just see the necessity for black control of the black communities only. I see working as well within that the possibilities and the necessity for black people to be on all policy-making bodies of all instruments in this country, instruments of government. So I don't know how this proceeds. I am for a left that says that the end of racism is part and parcel of the beginning of a revolutionary movement in this country. But it can't be done without it.
Some of the leaders of the student movements around the country, the latter-day militants, have been heard to describe the Communist Party as middle-aged and bourgeois and dull. I can see that you're none of those things, but do you meet that criticism when you talk to them, and how do you answer it?
Well, at first I did, and then as we begin to discuss, of course, they begin to see that this is not the case. The problem is that there is developing, and I welcome it, a whole new left movement in this country today among young people. And just as I was in 1946 when I joined the Communist Party and I looked around and I thought everybody was much older than I was 16. Well, of course, any revolutionary, who's gone through a siege is older than I. But also I began to learn that many of these people had learned through mistakes, through trial and error, but through doing, that they had established that they were a revolutionary party. And I think that many of the young people today are beginning to establish that kind of fact in their own mind, that regardless as to our age, we are a revolutionary party.
Mr. Munn, as your party approaches its centennial, it does not seem to have won the issue for which its name implies it exists. In fact, since the end of federal prohibition, many states have abolished their state prohibition laws and permitted liquor by the drink. Do you have any real hope of restoring this, reversing this trend and restoring prohibition?
Yes, if we didn't, there really wouldn't be much point in maintaining a political party. It is true that we are an old party and that we have had a broad platform. Maybe that would justify our maintenance of the party, and especially our emphasis on moral and spiritual values. But even so, we do have hope that we can see the time in the American life when prohibition will return to the United States.
Is this still the biggest, the most important plank in your platform, would you say?
It occupies the largest space. It has the most words in it, as far as that part is concerned. If you mean that that makes it the biggest one, why, perhaps that would be true. But as I said before, we do insist that any person, any party must have a broad, comprehensive program of government. This is the one plank of the party which basically welds the group together and makes the party continue to fight for the principles which it believes in.
What about some of your other platform planks? You, too, would like to give the income tax back to the states, as Mr. Hensley would, I believe.
No, I can't go along with just exactly what he said. The Prohibition Party, right or wrong, whichever way you want to interpret it, was the first political party to propose the income tax.
Interesting.
And then it was taken up by other parties. Incidentally, the Republicans never have sponsored it, never have approved it.
This is a very good instance, is it not, of minor parties feeding ideas into the system which later adopted by the major parties?
Well, very definitely it is. The historian of minor parties, Dr. Hesseltine, I believe it is, has indicated that much that the major parties have realized in the way of constructive, forward-looking legislation has initially been proposed by a minor party. And in many respects, that is definitely true.
So you think your party is responsible for the fact that we all pay income tax?
Now, just a minute. I'm not going to put it just exactly that way. We came up with the idea first, but we're having second thoughts at the present time. That's what caused you to ask the question.
What is your present position?
We believe that the whole tax program, the graduated income tax, needs to have a thorough examination, needs to be looked at very carefully, for we feel rather keenly that we are not getting from government what we really should get in terms of the amount of tax money that is paid into government. We do not ask, however, for the repeal of the income tax law. We do feel that probably there should be a division of income tax income with the states before the federal government takes it over. And this is a new plank in our platform this year. In that sense, we want a division, not a repudiation of the income tax idea.
Well, this, of course, Dr. Heller, with Congressman Laird on the Republican side of the aisle, they want to turn much of the revenue back to the states.
That's true. It's been rather interesting to me to find so many things cropping out in the present campaign, even on the part of major candidates, which the Prohibition Party has either sponsored or has thought about or has considered, has discussed, and these things are coming out now on the part of many of the major party candidates. But that's what minor parties do. They permit groups to protest. They permit groups to sponsor ideas which the major parties don't dare touch until they have been introduced and the people have become familiar with them.
Do you have any preference among the three leading contenders for the presidency, Mr. Mann?
Yes, I do, of course, but I'm not going to make a statement with regard to it on this program that way. I don't know, frankly, who's going to win. I know what the magazines say, I know what the newspapers write about it, but I'm not at all sure that anyone really knows. I do have a preference, but it would not be appropriate for me to state it here. I'm quite sure.
You're going to vote for yourself, or are you on the ballot in your state?
I'm sorry to say that we're not on the ballot. We presented about 1,100 more signatures than were required. We believe that the Board of Canvassers did not give us a fair shake in Michigan, but we do have write-in privileges. It was interesting to note that there seemed to be an undercover effort to even block us from a write-in privilege in Michigan. We won that right through a state Supreme Court decision, but we were not as fortunate as Wallace. We took our situation to the Supreme Court of the United States in 1966, but they wouldn't hear us. They did hear Wallace, and they've upset the ballot law in Ohio. And if there's any one thing that Wallace has contributed, it has been his contribution, which probably will make it easier for minor parties to get on the ballot in a number of different states.
You don't have much in common with him otherwise, I guess.
No, not too much. Oh, I agree that we need law and order, but I'm not sure that I want the kind of law and order that Mr. Wallace would call for. Someone asked me very seriously, seemingly, would you be willing to accept a position as vice presidential candidate under Wallace? And he seemed to be sincere about it. Of course, my answer was no.
Is it fair to describe yours as a conservative party, Mr. Munn?
Our party has had a history of conservative ideas and liberal ideas all along the way, and I suppose in between. Economically, our party is basically a conservative group. In terms of social legislation, in terms of some other factors that exist in this country, the party probably would be at least middle or possibly a little bit over on the liberal side. The Prohibition Party has not been traditionally an outstandingly conservative group. At the present time, economically, we probably are taking the most conservative stance that the party has ever taken.
You don't feel anything in common with Americans for Constitutional Action, Young Americans for Freedom, Senator Goldwater's Free Society group?
Well, now, I would have to answer that by saying this. I can't speak for everyone who is connected with the Prohibition Party movement. Probably there are some who would feel favorably inclined that way. But we are out on our own. We believe that there must be a political party back of any real change that takes place in this country, any real progressive movement. There must be a political party back of it. Otherwise, we'll experience the same things that we've experienced with the major parties at the present time. They may sponsor an idea, then they'll go back on it, as was the case with the 18th Amendment. But we are a government of political parties. Therefore, there must be a party to sponsor whatever movement it is that you desire. And that's why these people are sponsoring their movements. They know that it takes a political party to stand back of this sort of thing.
Thank you, Mr. Munn. We will now ask them and you each to make a closing statement, beginning with Mr. Blomain.
Well, the Socialist Labor Party is very much opposed to violence. It also expresses great sorrow and understanding and compassion for the racial divisions which today afflict American society. But the Socialist Labor Party also points out that society is divided into two classes. The working class, whether they be made up of black, white, or Irish, doesn't make a bit of difference. And America today is owned by a relatively small handful of owners of the 500 largest corporations, the capitalist class. Our working class produces all of the social wealth. Our working class runs industry from the top to the bottom. And we point out that it is possible to achieve peaceably the change from capitalism to socialism by organizing politically and backing up the political vote by the thoroughgoing industrial organization of the working class for the purpose of making the industries the property of all the people. I would like to say here that anyone who would like to receive a free illustrated brochure can address a card to the Socialist Labor Party, Box 200, Brooklyn 2, New York. Socialist Labor Party, Box 200, Brooklyn 2, New York.
Thank you.
The issues that today are agitating people in this campaign are issues that cannot be solved under capitalism. The war in Vietnam is a product of the predatory capitalist interests in their struggle for markets throughout the world, control of resources, and the building of an economic empire. The racial problem cannot be solved under capitalism because of the competition between workers for wages and housing and so on.
Thank you, Mr. Blomain. Mr. Halstead.
Yeah. Well, the central problem facing the country is that both the major political parties are run by big business and controlled by them, and they don't even listen to what happens in their own primaries. And the problem is to build within the country an independent political movement which is controlled by the working class and the black people and the common people, and which is outside of and opposed to the Democratic and Republican Party, and Wallace's party too, which is simply the old Dixiecrat wing of the Democratic Party on a little different tactic. And that movement is beginning to come into existence in the form of the anti-war movement, the student struggles, the Black Power movement, and so on. We would favor the development of a labor party and of an independent black political party, which in alliance could dominate the country's politics and make a fundamental change in the country, and we would support such a development. In the meantime, the way to vote against the war in Vietnam is not to vote for Humphrey, Nixon, or Wallace, who are going to continue to carry it out, but to cast a protest vote for the Socialist Workers' Party. Imagine what would have happened in 1964 if all those millions of people who voted for Johnson as a peace candidate instead had voted for the Socialist. And we stand for siding with the revolutionary developments throughout the world in the advanced capitalist countries like the United States, in the colonial countries like in Vietnam and Cuba and so on, and also in the Soviet orbit. Like we side with the Czechoslovak communists fighting for individual human freedom. And if you're interested in joining such a movement and further information about it, then contact the Socialist Workers' Party at 873 Broadway, New York. That's 873 Broadway, New York. And remember, as the old socialist Eugene V. Debs used to say, it's better to vote for what you want and not get it than to vote for what you don't want and get it.
Mr. Hensley, may we have your closing statement?
Yes, say that I think the Universal Party has a good platform. It has a good working, something that'll help men to unify people. We say that our brotherly love, or we might speak of it, of one to another, is leaving this country because of great big powers dominating. We believe in a cooperative working system rather than an organized system where you commit your power to some head. We don't believe that. We believe that every man should be an individual and always be an individual. And we're working to that end. And if anyone would like to know more about me, well, same as anyone else, well, you can write to Universal Life Church, it's Modesto, California. But the main basic ideal that I'm after is to bring church and state together, because that is the hopes of all mankind is. And when it becomes together, then we can do away with the church and state both. And when we do away with it, well, we will then set up a new system, because there's no use in trying to set up a new system as long as the old system dominates. We have to fight the old system, and once it get hit out of the way, then we can bring forth something new. And I certainly appreciate being on this program. Thank you, brother.
Now the closing statement from Mrs. Charlene Mitchell, the presidential candidate of the Communist Party.
Yes. Although our campaign is not one just to pile up votes, we do consider the electoral process to be an extremely important thing. And here in California, aside from the candidates that are here present, I am very sorry that Mr. Cleaver could not come, because I think that in Mr. Cleaver's candidacy is that kind of independent alignment on the left that is beginning to take place. And I do not want to in any way say that my candidacy is going to be in contradiction to his, especially when it comes to the issues about which we are both so very much concerned. That is the ending of racism in this country and the ending of the war in Vietnam. Now, I want to say further, the Communist Party is a revolutionary party, and we believe that it is impossible, so long as man is exploited in the position of being exploited by another man, that it is really impossible to have a humane system in which to live. However, we feel that it is absolutely impossible to create a revolutionary movement in this country, a revolutionary movement that will overturn the capitalist system. Once that capitalist system has been overturned, the possibilities then for absolute ending of racism, of the ending of the possibility even for war, and once you are able to eliminate those two evils, then I think that we will have the possibility of the freest and most democratic form of government. But I also would like to point out that when people talk about income tax, when people talk about all of these questions, I am for the ending of an income tax on people who earn less than $10,000 a year. I am for an increase on the income tax of all of the millionaires in this country. I think this country has to be turned over to its people and not to the minority.
May I mention again that we too regret the absence of Mr. Cleaver of the Peace and Freedom Party, who accepted our invitation, but on the day of the broadcast was unable to appear. Finally, the closing statement of the Prohibition Party candidate, Mr. Munn.
On behalf of this group gathered here this afternoon, I would like to thank you people for inviting us here. It's been a real privilege to be here, and we ought to recognize what you are permitting us to do in stating our positions on various campaign issues. Now, the Prohibition Party, as many people know, some do not, is positively committed to constitutional government, to the free enterprise system, to a balanced federal budget, and to sensible economy in governmental expenditures. It's opposed strongly to totalitarianism, to socialism, and to a welfare state. And that puts me in a little different category from some of the other people who have been speaking here this afternoon. It believes in separation of church and state, contrary to Mr. Hensley's position. It does call for moral responsibility in government and for a new evaluation of our foreign policy. We feel that that is quite important. It's opposed to federal aid to education. Again, we differ. It's opposed to racial segregation. It's also opposed to artificial integration, taking a position of opposition in both of their areas. We believe that there should be a program of human rights that's really based on the element of Christian responsibility. It demands, too, a return of ballot privileges to minor parties. And I think that all of us can agree probably on that one thing, if on nothing else. The major parties have erected ballot law barriers which make it most difficult for minor parties to function and to perform the function which they ought to do. Now, in this country, there needs to be developed a real spirit, concern for truth, a new sense of responsibility on the part of our people, a resurgence of moral courage, and a dedication to that which is right. And that should help us all along the way. Our post office address is Box 2255, Kalamazoo, Michigan.
Mrs. Mitchell, you didn't give yours.
Our office number is 23 West 26th Street, New York, 10.
Thank you. These have been the views of 5 candidates for the office of President of the United States. Over 2 centuries of American political evolution, many important ideas, as we noted earlier, have appeared first in the platform of minor parties. The Socialist Party attracted hundreds of thousands of votes in the 30s and then saw many of its platform pledges carried out by a major party president. Furthermore, George Wallace, by getting on the ballot in 50 states this year, has proved that this country is not necessarily wedded permanently and exclusively to a quadrennial choice between the Democrats and the Republicans. And so we presented today 5 minority candidates whose names will appear on the ballot in a number of states. They also run. And if you see some of the names of them on your ballot, it's perhaps important that you know who they are and where they stand. Good evening.